Is that okay? So I'll just repeat it.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, just repeat it for the sake of recording with a switch it on. But these are the three areas that we are looking at covering. So role of HR in modern day organizations in the modern context, looking at how HR actually effectively contributes towards the achievement of organizational objectives, and what is the correlation between organizational performance and human resource management. So let's look at the first in particular. Now, could you briefly summarize what do you think are the key responsibilities of an HR manager in an organization?
Okay, so in terms of HR and organisation, it's about developing and advising organisation and implementing policies that help the organisation achieve its strategic objectives by making sure that the workforce is in place and planned and they've got the right skill mix and training and development in place to be able to achieve what the organisation wants to do. So very much working with individual departments, senior leads and heads of department and directors to make sure that they are capturing information that helps the organisation recruit the right people, the right skill sets, looking at making sure these are kind of mirroring what the organisation's sort of long-term plans are to help, so they can help design the organisation in a way that makes.
So if that's fine, Mark. If I just quickly interrupt you here and say, if you were to take an example of, say, a company and give us an idea in terms of what would be the 3 or 4 key functions do you see as an HR manager doing?
So in terms of an organisation I work with at the moment, which is the Housing Association HR team, work with the senior management to help set and identify key business areas that will help support the organisation's development performance, help plan recruitment, help plan development and run development opportunities, coaching, mentoring, designing the organisation, and having in place performance measures so that the HR function can actually measure whether or not what they're doing is actually what they need to do, measuring output as well as financial spend and delivery of key objectives.
Right, okay, that's fine. So if I have to relate that into 2 or 3 broad areas, in the housing association, the HR manager would be looking at, obviously doing a bit of resource planning. That would mean that planning, recruitment, selection, and, if there are new employees to be brought in. They might look at doing a bit of training and development, which is a traditional, area wherein the existing employees would be put through a CPD or a performance appraisal, identify the gap areas, and then look at, initiating some sort of training and development for them for the year in terms of a program. And the third thing would be they would look at, evaluation of performance, and that will be in the form of annual performance appraisals, which are done to, obviously see if the goals and objectives have been achieved. And this would be done in tandem with, maybe a sitting with the line manager or their line manager with regards to the person being reviewed by the line manager and the HR, looking at evaluation against the objectives which were given or the roles and responsibilities which were given. So from that context, just elaborating on the slide, here what we see is one of the key things that we see in HR when we look at most of these organizations, millennial organizations as we call them, like the Deliveroo's and the Uber and all. I think one of the key things which is coming across is that the job responsibility or the job description is becoming a key in terms of hiring, specifically during recruitment, is because most of these organizations are task oriented, and what the HR role is looking at doing now is streamlining some of the key aspects of how the job description links into the key deliverables from an individual's perspective for the role or the responsibility that they're be taking into the organization. So when I say human resources, they are looking at it from a point of view of how you become a part and parcel of a strategy which helps achieve the overall objective of the organization or a department or a subsidiary or maybe a strategic business unit. And what we do get to see now is that within these organizations, because we are kind of distributed and most of these operations are across various cities, locations, offices, what tends to happen is that the HR role is also becoming a bit divided or fragmented in the sense that there is a local champion which is also been given the additional responsibility if the setup is small, or if it's a large setup, then a additional responsibility, additional headcount in terms of a local champion, which kind of manages, this close correlation of job description with the delivery in terms of task to help achieve the overall objective of the organization. An example here would be most of these organizations, when we look at Uber and Deliveroo and the case that was brought across, in London, that these employees are not being contracted, they do not get any benefits in terms of pension, medical benefits, leave, and all that. And the company lost the case, and obviously they've been forced to now put policies into places, because what they did and realized was that there was no local champion who was looking at championing the concept of managing resources from a human perspective, in terms of having 40,000 drivers who are licensed to drive Uber cabs in the UK alone. If you look at, there is no concept of HR management in this organization, or even if it's a very vague concept. And now with this case of ruling coming in, what they've tried to do is bring some of these guidelines and legislation introduced by the courts into the framework, and this framework is now being kind of monitored and is going to be kind of implemented using local champions, which will be based in different cities. So if you have London, which has 20,000 drivers, there might be 20, 30, 50, 100 people who will manage this, or they'll bring in a software or a system to manage this, and to manage this well, so that they are seen to be not just meeting the legislation, but also seen as an organization to comply with the legislation which has been brought out, by the court in terms of facilitating these benefits which are required as contracted employees.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other bit that we will look at now, when you look at, this quite well, is that when we see HR strategy, it's a combination of a lot of things which affects how the HR strategy is built up in an organization, whether it's an annual strategy, 3-year strategy, or a 5-year strategy. So there are lots of things which kind of influence, and HR has to take a lot of inputs from different sources to incorporate those, points, or essentially areas of, let's put it this way, influence into the strategy. Now, there are some areas which will be external market influence areas, which could be the government, the legislation acts, or various places that the companies operates in. Part of it is a reflection of business strategy, incorporating into job descriptions, performance appraisals, inputs from employees. It could be through 360-degree feedback appraisals, things like that. Effect of corporate culture, competitors, bringing some of the best practices from competitors, looking at the market in general to try and see when they look at pay, packages, benefits, things like that. That is something which is influenced. And then lastly, but not the least, they look at how their role in the organization is also influencing the strategy, in terms of looking at the whole chain, from somebody being an HR supervisor up to the chief HR manager or the CXO, somebody in the C range, influencing policy and how it fits in the overall strategy of the organization. Now, this is becoming important is because there are lots of resources which a lot of companies use, but the human resource is one such critical resource which is now using most of the resources to get the things done. So if you look at a manufacturing organization here, what we are talking about is a lot of jobs in the factory or the production floor is done by robots or automated machines and things like that. But the people or the resource which is operating that resource is the human resource. Now, if you have the right set of people in right places, you're able to then, obviously get productivity, efficiency, and, the output which is required. But if you don't have the right set of people doing the right set of jobs, then obviously the productivity and the efficiency of the organization overall can come down. So the key part is the HR strategy has is influenced by a lot of different factors, and these factors have to be incorporated into the overall HR strategy to make it effective and to work in line with the organization. Now, there is something called 4 Ps. Have you heard about these 4 Ps?
Yes, we use something similar in health and safety as well.
That's fine. Okay. So basically, just like the 4 Ps of marketing, there are 4 Ps in HR which have got introduced, and that's something which looks at purpose, plan, part, and picture. So the 4 Ps of change, anything which involves change or bringing in change, most HR managers look at planning around these 4 Ps. So what is the purpose of the training? What is the purpose of, introducing a change? What is the plan, the timeline, or the expected milestones which are going to be used? A simple project would be, a simple example that I could give here would be a project wherein the HR is looking at relocating an office. So if I have to extrapolate that into and apply the 4 Ps would be, what is the bigger picture? The bigger picture is there might be a change in vision, look at cost cutting, or, maybe larger premises involving a cheaper labor force, whatever. So the management would decide that, okay, we need to shift offices because of these 3, 4, 5 objectives. Now, once that has been done, we identify the purpose of why the change has been done, and this is then explained in the language to the staff, which is what they are tuned to understanding. So they won't want to know the objectives of cost cutting and the organization downscaling, downsizing, and things like that. They would want to understand what is the reason why we want to go. So maybe a better office, more wider places, lesser commuting times, and that would become the purpose of portrayal from the HR's point of view to the employees. Now, and at some stage, HR does have to get involved in giving out a plan that it'll happen in phases, no redundancies would be done, or, people will not be affected, our work routines will not be affected, there'll be a flexibility during that time frame, to work from home, or, when the transition is happening. And that is to help most of the resources to adapt to this change. And the part that they will need to play will be explained using the 4 Ps. You're obviously aware of the change management concept and models like the quarters model, step model, and Levin's model, and this is very keenly applied within HR in particular. So we look at things and change management when it is to happen. The idea of applying these models relevant to the situation is to kind of smoothen or lessen the burden of transition from an HR perspective when it's happening for the organization.
Yeah.
Now, I want to go through with you a second important thing, which is to understand, the incorporation of ethics or ethical issues which are coming into HR. Now, what is your understanding of key ethical issues which are coming into, play from an HR perspective within organizations?
Well, one of the key changes that the millennial group are starting to drive changes in how businesses operate and how businesses realise what they're looking for when they're looking for a new job. So people tend to be a lot more ethically aware. And it's not just about money these days, it's about working for an organisation that does the right thing, looks after people, complies with the law, treats people equally, pays people for the same job at the same wage, equal pay issues, making sure that people know what they're meant to be doing, when and how, making sure there's governance in place to make sure that things are being done both legally and in terms of making sure the organisation moves financially into a more viable place sometimes, and that there are people there that lead with it by example and have principles that kind of embedded within the organisation to make sure people treat people well, customers get what they're looking for, and to make sure that things like privacy, HR management, IT, and policies relating to that are managed as well.
That's absolutely fine. I think so. Yeah, the key point that is now being looked at and is becoming a part and parcel of the HR, department or the role of HR is that they need to look at following through on the legislation which is very pertinent to a particular geography in which you operate. So things like which you rightly mentioned, pay issues, discrimination, some of the legislation which is there in the UK with respects to the employment law. We look at the Minimal Wage Act. We look at things like discrimination, health and safety, as you mentioned. Some of these things and the way the work environment needs to be structured. So most of the things required or tools required to be able to function effectively within the organization is now becoming a part and parcel of HR. So things like if you're disabled or you have staff which require additional complements to be able to work and effectively deliver on work, those have to be looked at from a point of view of HR. Some of the other, cliched functions which were already looked at, and they are a part and parcel of large organizations, are things like, compensation plans, benefit structures, performance appraisals. And, because a lot of organizations like you rightly reflected, millennials, which now a lot of organizations are storing a lot of data. And because data is personal, so the HR function is becoming integral to that aspect, is that security of that personal data, privacy issues have to be looked at, and they need to be carefully monitored, controlled, and there needs to be a stepwise access available to only authorized people within the organization who should get access to that personal data. So I think these are the key aspects of ethical practices which are now being implemented or need to be implemented within organizations, because of the availability of a lot of data, and also because of increasing complexity of the legislation being introduced in order for the HR department to follow and implement that further. Now, lastly, looking at two or three things very briefly, is you're aware of some of these techniques that we look at to do audit, do performance appraisal, look at overall achievement of vision and strategy when we use balanced scorecard, and things like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if I have to ask you to say summarize what is balanced scorecard, what would you do? What would you define it as?
It's looking at a range of things. Looking at the organisation as a whole rather than one particular key performance indicator. So looking at internal and external measures, looking at what the organisation wants to achieve, making sure people know what the strategy is, so it all feeds in together, and basically making sure that you've got a range of measures to show that what you're delivering on isn't just one particular thing, but they'll merge together to meet the organisational objectives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So just adding on to what you've said, as you know that, a lot of organizations, when they start off initially, they look at the usual, techniques to do appraisals, and those would be typically looking at sitting down for reviewing with the concerned person or the employee in terms of the key objectives being achieved. So in the case of sales, for example, it could be sales figures. In the case of marketing, it could be market share. But in the case of production and manufacturing or engineering employees, it could be primarily to look at, qualitative factors which they've been able to achieve, which could be part of project achievements in the projects, or it could be even part achievements of certain projects, because some of these plans across organizations are 2, 3, 5, 10 years long. So if you look at, say, for example, Dyson, Dyson is a company in the UK. They bring across a lot of revolutionary products. So the eyeball vacuum cleaner, which they introduced, that had a product gestation cycle of about 3.5 years before it was brought out. Now, people working within the engineering and production teams or the product teams were actually then performance evaluated every year across a period of 3 years until the product will launch. And that is where the review and the performance appraisal cycles actually vary when we look at different types of organizations and different employees working within different departments. Now, most organizations at that level have started to use something called balanced scorecard, which you're aware of. And that is primarily looking at an overall review system, bringing in the strategy, which is used as one of the key tools to do performance management. So here you will look at HR managers and also the individual line managers using this as a method to basically track the execution of activities, which then can be used to control and monitor the staff against the activities which have been given. So you see these matrices which are drawn up. So it is a task-based activity culture which is now coming across in most manufacturing production companies, because there the key is looking at productivity. Now, sometimes organizations wherein HR audit happens and they look at benchmarking, these are agile techniques that we look at, which is primarily to set the processes in place within the organization, wherein what they do is they compare and measure some of the current practices vis-a-vis previous scenarios or scenarios, or competitive scenarios, and reevaluate some of these things to bring them in line with what the current requirement of the organization is. And this is basically done to fight against the strategy within that organization. So if we took an example of Carillion in the past, and in the last discussion we discussed that had some of these things been in place, had an audit been done whether it's an HR, financial audit, whatever, some of these systematic failures could have been brought to light earlier rather than leading to the collapse of the company. Because at some stage, somewhere, these audits would have been able to capture why the system is failing or which part of the system was failing. Now, looking at how HR does contribution towards the organization in terms of the strategy. Now, here, what I want to do is basically look at a correlation between, how the organizational performance, when we look at some of the organizations wherein we see high productivity, we see high profitability, return on investment, earnings per share, whatever benchmark and matrix we look at, we do see that in those companies, in general, through McKinsey's research, it has come out quite clear that the HR department plays a very integral part in ensuring that the employees who are happy are the employees who are more productive, and the employees are able to contribute on a long-term basis and buy the vision of the organization. Buy into the vision of the organization, what I mean. So here, I think the key thing, some of the organizations we look at, give you an example of Apple, for example. We knew that when the succession planning was being done, when Steve Jobs was kind of diagnosed with cancer and he was undergoing therapy and all that stuff, Tim Cook had already stepped into his role to drive not just the operations, but also to look at making key decisions. Now, he was already identified as a successor to Steve Jobs. When we look at some of the other organizations, we do not see this happening until the very last moment when the transition is supposed to happen. And if this transition is not given time, then it starts to affect the organizational performance. That means the business will either dip, the share price will take a beating, or in some cases we will see an exodus of employees because they do not buy into the vision of the person who's actually stepping into that role. So when we look at this particular aspect of HR functioning quite well, what we do get to see is that some of the techniques that we look at for measuring performance, like balanced scorecard, benchmarking, audit, they all start to play into this particular equation of organizational performance vis-a-vis the contribution of HR, is because these parts allow them or allow the HR to clearly identify and differentiate performance vis-a-vis the requirements, skills and attributes and experience required to look at performing or look at basically putting somebody into somebody's shoes. So when we look at succession planning in this case, the idea is they would have picked him up from amongst the tier of other, senior management officials, that Tim Cook, when I say he would have been the only one to kind of step in and take that role, because the person might have had that experience and also the relevant knowledge and skills with regards to all the departments to be able to lead that organization. So my question to you in this case would be, again, with regards to a specific organization, can you think of an example which is that, significant, or think of an example which kind of clearly highlights, a case in point of HR playing a very crucial role to look at succession planning, or, in the selection of a CEO of an organization?
Okay. Well, one organisation I can think of is a public sector organisation where the CEO's recently resigned. Mm-hmm. Initially, they wanted to go straight outside the market to recruit somebody. However, the sector is quite difficult to recruit him for a new CEO. There's lots of other factors regarding sort of cultural fits. This is in the stage of delivering quite a complex change program and corporate sort of objectives around new business and growth. So initially, they wanted to go outside the market. I helped them understand some of the cultural aspects, some of the values, some of the sort of key strategic and financial aspects of doing that. And they basically decided to look in-house. The financial director was then an obvious choice because she was involved in the organisation already, understood the core business, understood how the business worked and the key projects were ongoing. And that FD now has been receiving coaching and mentoring from another CEO outside the business that's helping her now step into the role of CEO on a longer term process.
That's fine. Okay. So essentially, that if we look at this particular slide, I think the key takeaway in that would be that if we look at how HR kind of helps in now, selecting the, the next generation leaders within the organization, for an organization can also come in from within the organization if the HR process is working effectively. That means they know they have a full mapping of the senior management team within the organization. They know the skill set, the experience, and the potential of the individuals. They've gone through some process of training and development, or have been in the organization long enough to be one in terms of understanding the operations of the organization, being classified as loyal enough to the organization, and also buying into the long-term vision and being a believer of the vision of the organization. And that is where only HR can step in and have that, let's put it this way, the HR can step in, and they are the ones which have that visibility into who he or she would be in terms of the right person to lead the organization, provided such a situation is to come in. Now, just briefly, what do you understand by human capital, or this concept of the human capital investment?
So human capital is made of human capital tends to be aspects that make up the organisation. So it's about individual skills, competencies, how you manage and manage those people and measure in a way that helps the organisation. It's looking at making sure you've got reward and recognition packages that retain and recruit staff or teams that you need to deliver your long-term objectives. It's about organisational team and job design, so HR get involved, either with existing teams or when there's a new service being delivered or a new service being developed, looking at making sure there's an organisational structure, team, and have the right people in the organisation to deliver the service. Also looking at change management and leadership and how that works, and all needs to sort of meet the same sort of values and culture. The people that you employ or you start to develop within the organisation have to buy into that culture. So, for example, housing organisations I work with, people that work in that sector have to absolutely love the sector. It's not a commercial sector. They tend to have a different sort of personal value set and mission for coming to work, rather than just going to earn money and deliver on sort of financial gains to an organisation in that particular sector.
Sure, okay, that's fine. I think so. Basically, the concept of this, what you said is absolutely correct. Not a problem with that. I think in terms of the concept of human capital investment came in when, or the concept of human capital essentially came in when most of the industrialization had happened in the developed world, and they realized that not all labor is equal, and in terms of the quality of employee, could be improved by investing into training and development. So one of the key things which came about as a function was that in order to, most organizations want to go out and get the best employees possible to do the work, right? Now, when they look at the cost of acquisition of that employee or that cost of acquisition of that human capital into the company, that could be a significant barrier for organizations, because they might not have the affordability, or they might not be able to buy into the vision of the person coming into the organization. So what a lot of organizations started to do was they started to invest into the existing resources using training and development to try and get them to a level wherein they could take senior management leadership positions and do the various types of jobs required within the organization from time to time. Now, this could be at the mid-management, senior management, or junior management level. So this concept that when it arose, basically was that you could train and improve your capital in terms of human capital when you look at resources internally by investing into them through the means of training and development, through the means of CPD, career professional development, and other impediments which could be removed in order for them to work more effectively. Now, briefly looking at that, why do you think that we have this concept now applied more and more in modern day organizations?
Well, because as we mentioned before, people with the skill set you want and the cultural values, etc. you want, often aren't available on the marketplace. Also, if you're not tapping into your existing in-house sort of skill set and people that work for you already, they're likely to get bored and move on. So organisations that have more of a coaching culture and one of continuous professional development, and they can see that there's a path from the bottom to the top of the organisation. Organisations that have those sort of processes are known to be quite a lot more successful. They retain staff and they bring people on with the organisations. People have a choice of where they want to go within the organisation. They want to stay where they are, that's fine, but they get to know different aspects of the organisation. They can step in and help when need be. And there's also a path to you retaining people all the way through the organisation that know you, know your business, know you how your customers. It's better sort of longer term for sort of continuity of service, and also it's very expensive to go into the marketplace, recruit new people when you've lost someone, and the costs related to recruiting just an administrator, for example, when someone resigns, could be £30,000 when you look at kind of someone's leaving, their performance drops. It costs a lot of money to go out to the market, the recruitment process, and then getting someone embedded in the organisation, induction, and getting them up to speed so they're performing at the same level the last person was. That can cost anything over £30,000 just to recruit one basic member of staff. And you have that person leaving by understanding what their values are, what their personal development needs or sort of working preferences were. You might not have lost that person. You might have avoided the issues around sort of dropping performance, customer experience might have dropped, those sort of things.
Yeah, totally agree. So I think from that point of view, that is correct. I think the main reason why, with an example, I think some of the points that you made are absolutely fine. But if I look at it from an example point of view, we look at, say, organizations which are mostly providing services, and those services are dependent on employees, or basically resources which are staff resources. So in those cases, what most organizations want to do is they want to avoid the cost of, as you rightly mentioned, redundancies, retraining, and in some cases that cost could be as high as about 30,000 pounds when they look at, depending on the stature or the level of where the employee is actually joining. So in services organization, what they decided was that, okay, if we keep investing on new technology, new types of things which help us make us productive, why not let us invest on our resource which actually utilizes all this? So what they came up with the concept of was, okay, let's train and let's invest into education or invest into training equipment, which will help us kind of, make our resources much more knowledgeable, have more skills, and because of which they will be able to perform much better. And that in turn would, and then what they did was in turn put the whole package together. So perks, benefits, emoluments, bonuses, structures in such a way that the whole organization, when you look at the full package, you look at it as a full package, and you look at it where the organization wants you, the organization wants to retain you, the organization wants to promote you, or wants to give you more, incentives. And that is where the concept of this human, capital strategy came about, wherein when we see this application happening in the likes of Google and some of the Silicon Valley organizations, wherein the offices and the environment in which the employees typically work is made so congenial that they cannot sometimes see a crossover happening between the personal and professional life. And the idea is, because the culture is task oriented, and most of the jobs that they do in these organizations is resource oriented from a point of view of capital, which is human resource, and what they've done is they've said, okay, most important resource, let's invest most into the most important resource, rather than just also propping up some of the other resources which we do from time to time, things like infrastructure, IT and other benefits. So that is where that concept came across, and it's become quite tightly knitted now in most modern organizations when we look at it. And that's the reason why managing human resources is becoming a key function again, as against the concept when we saw it in the early 60s and 70s when post World War II industrialization happened. A lot of people went into work, and this was this was merely coming across as a function, but this is becoming more and more important.
Also, organisations where the senior managers display more of a servant leadership style, where they actually ask people, what do you need to do your job? How can you do your job better? How can we make sure your job gets done easily and quickly and efficiently? So there's more of a bottom-up sort of flow of communication that can also help organisations in terms of human capital investment, making sure that projects work well, people know what they're doing. And when the organisation makes changes, they tend to be more successful because they've had feeding whatever they're looking at investing in.
Correct. Absolutely fine. I think that's absolutely okay. I think we've covered some of the bits that we wanted to look at as far as this topic in this section is concerned. So I'm happy with the discussion that we've had, and I think these 2-3 specific questions that we wanted to cover, we've hit them on the nail.
Excellent.
Brilliant. So what I will